Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to day 3 of Miami Film Festival. My name is Jay LaPlante. I'm the festival director. I'm really happy that we are here for our second year of the Night Heroes program. So this program was designed when we saw filmmakers interacting with some of the local filmmakers interacting with our international guests at some of the festival social events, and we thought, really, we should have more time to talk about, you know, their trajectory and their careers. And last year, in our first year, it was a really fascinating conversation. It was real talk, about their journeys. And I think there's something so magical about this moment, about being able to share in these filmmakers' journey and learn from them. So it's all thanks to the incredible Knight Foundation. As always, Knight Foundation has rebuilt this city, culturally speaking. And I'm grateful that they love my idea, and they funded this for 5 years, and we're in the year 2. And I want to bring out Priya Sakar from the Knight Foundation and say thank you for all her support.
Thank you, Jay. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Awesome. You guys have been partying hard, I can tell. I know, because I was there Friday night. It was a really great party and great screening. So I am so thrilled to be here on behalf of Knight Foundation. As Jay said, Knight has been supporting the arts in Miami for many years, and we support the arts because we believe they connect people to each other and to the places where we live. And I can't think of a better example of that than the Miami Film Festival. I was really honored to get to be here last year, as I was a newbie, having just joined Knight Foundation as Director of Arts, and also as a new transplant to Miami, and just had such a wonderful time as a film lover and a new resident of this city, partaking in the film festival last year, and as an audience member in this event last year, which is our first time doing it. So just huge congratulations to Jay and your whole team at the Miami Film Festival for all that you do to support filmmakers and the love of film in this city. We are so thrilled to be a part of it. So thank you all for being here today. I'm going to join you in the audience for this great conversation. Have fun.
Thank you so much. I'd like to wish you all happy International Women's Day. Yeah. And I want to bring out our kick-ass programmer, Kiva Reardon.
Hi everyone, I'm Kiva. Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Priya. Thank you to the Knight Foundation. Thank you so much, everyone who came out today. So welcome to the second edition of this series. If anyone was here last year, thank you for your continued support. If it's your first time, welcome. The idea behind this series, as Jay was saying, is to spotlight incredible talents in film who are, in their own unique ways, and I think we'll keep coming back to this idea of uniqueness, are carving a path to create the art that they want to make and also tell the stories that they want to tell. So this year, we're very pleased to have with us Stella Meghie, Joe Talbot, and Lulu Wang. So if you were here last year, you'll know that each speaker comes up, they give a little talk, and then afterwards we have a conversation, and then of course we also want to leave time for a Q&A so that you can also ask your questions of these filmmakers. So before I bring up our first speaker, I just want to note that, again, like last year when curating this group, it was really important to find people and find filmmakers who were approaching their crafts and their careers in a different way. And I think that just makes it more interesting because you'll get some kind of variety. But I also think this really underlines that there is no one singular path, and that in fact this pursuit of linearity, or that the only way to success is from A to Z, or Z, sorry, because I am Canadian, so A to Z, isn't only a maddening pursuit, but in fact also can really limit your creativity. So on that note, it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker. So her last film, The Photograph, was called A Shimmering Romance by The Guardian, and Manola Dargis wrote of it, "Movies like this tell us that falling in love is easy. Cue the thunderbolt looks, passionate kisses, surging orchestration. But if it were really that simple, then there wouldn't be so much to tell. So bring on the agonies, tempests, and tears." Hailing from Toronto, thank you. Nice. You really read that beat well. Hailing from Toronto, Stella Meghie is, I lost my place because I was so excited for that Toronto applause. Hailing from Toronto, Stella made her featured directorial debut, Jean of the Joneses, which debuted at South by Southwest and earned her first screenplay nomination at the 2017 Independent Spirit Awards. Her follow-up, The Weekend, premiered at the Toronto International Film Festival, and The Photograph was released on February 14th, 2020, and is in theaters now. So before I bring Stella up on stage, I would like us to all watch the trailer for The Photograph. If we can roll that, please.
My May, my daughter. I put my love into photographs, pictures, took space in my heart instead of people.
This was supposed to be a date.
It is a date.
I love you.
I love you too.
I just don't understand why she couldn't tell me about her life while she was alive.
Maybe she thought it would help you look at her in another way.
Hey, I'm Michael Block from the Republic. I'm doing a story about your mom.
How's your article coming?
To be honest, I was a little distracted, so I kept running back in my mind how you might respond to me asking you for a drink.
So that was you asking me?
In my mind, it wasn't that forward, you know what I mean? It was more smoother than that.
I'm terrible at first dates. I just don't know whether to be vulnerable, aloof, funny.
Why don't you just be yourself?
What?
I'm wondering if it's not too early in the night to kiss you.
It wasn't too early.
Oh, I see.
He's in love. This written all over your face. You look so sappy, it's embarrassing.
Wanna believe what you say.
Why you got your head down like you pray?
Because I might need to.
What would you pray for?
My patience.
Willpower. I keep reading her words.
Don't you want more than this?
I want you. What more do you want?
My mother wasn't very good at love. What if I'm just like her? How are you supposed to know if you want to spend forever with someone?
I want to try to be together.
It's not practical.
I'm not trying to be practical. I want to be with you.
I said the opposite of everything that I wanted to say.
I wish I didn't leave people behind so often.
I let her leave 30 years later, still trying to figure that out.
What would you have done differently?
I would have gone after her.
My May, I wish I had put as much courage into love as I put in my work.
I don't want to lose you because I'm afraid to love you.
You don't have to be afraid.
What'd y'all do when the power went out today?
Yo, she did the little sip and smile thing, like.
Please join me in welcoming to the stage Stella Meghie.
Oh, Lakeith, I love him. Well, thank you for having me, and thank you to Miami Film Festival for inviting me. Kiva, when she sent the email about doing the speech, she talked about talking about heroism. So as I was sitting down to write it, I was like, what does heroism mean to me in terms of filmmaking. And I thought about some of the filmmakers that are heroes to me that inspired me to start. People like Spike Lee and Gina Prince Bythewood and Pedro Almodovar and Tamara Jenkins, people that I went back to their films over and over when I was starting out. When I think of being in school and seeing She's Gotta Have It for the first time, because it was impossible to get, kind of. I think it only went on digital a few years ago. So for me, that film in particular was something that gave me courage, because it was about Black women and men exploring, their psyches, relationships, emotions, and so often I feel like as a filmmaker of color, a Black woman, that is seen as frivolous. And so to see someone like Spike and know that that's a film he went to Cannes with, and that's how he got his start, and that's how Black women could speak, and that's how, we could be seen on camera, and how we could use jazz. It was, I watched it over and over again in school to remind myself that I could be who I wanted to be, that I didn't need to, do something more important, and that exploring the psyches of Black women was important work. I think a lot, I forget who said it, but it was she talked about being the own leading lady in your story. I don't know if it was Nora Ephron, I can't remember. But there's this idea of being the own leading lady in your story. And for me, I think, it applies to being a hero. When I think of my career and the films I've made in the past years, there's the people in your life who support you, who have helped get those films made, but you really do, I think, have to be the hero of your own story to be a filmmaker and to get films made. You have to be your own champion. No one is ever gonna fight kind of as much as you are. I think the word heroism sounds so scary. It sounds big. It sounds like you have to change the world, and it's just these little moments. There's a joke in the photograph, if you've seen it, and it's, during the date scene, and they're kind of laboring over, Lakeith and Issa are laboring over, Kendrick versus Drake. Obviously, it's Drake for me because I'm Canadian, but the reason that Issa's character says she doesn't, that she can't get with Kendrick is because he makes her feel guilty. He makes her feel like she has to be a change in the world, and it feels so big. And I think that's what I was coming to with the idea of heroism, that it's, when you think about it, so big, of changing, an industry or society, it's not, it can feel overwhelming, but it is really the small things you do in your own career and in the careers of others around you to help that can change things. I was doing a Q&A and someone, a filmmaker was asking me for advice, and I said, and I've had filmmakers say this to me too, aren't you afraid to kind of push? And, on the photograph, I pushed to get my editor, who had never done a studio film, onto it. And I just didn't take no for an answer. And I had a filmmaker say, weren't you afraid that you were going to look difficult, that you were gonna, that they would clamp down in other ways? And I was just like, no, you just have to do what feels right to you, have to do what makes you feel safe, makes you feel like you can do your best work. Because, I said, you can't play by the rules in a game that was not built for you. That was the sentiment that I kind of try to live by. Thank you. You really do have to, I talked to a filmmaker yesterday where I was just you really can't go by a blueprint. You have to do the things that are gonna help you move forward, because the infrastructure is not meant for us to be here. I think the DGA last time I checked was 4% African American. I don't want to know what women in that category are. So you really do just have to just push in the way that makes sense to you. I feel like right before I made Gina the Joneses, like, I was just like, oh my God, am I going to make it? Like, is this the career, or am I gonna be, signing up for some 9-to-5 job, for the rest of my life? And I feel like I took on this unlikely hero persona of Mike Tyson, and my friends always laugh at me, but I always imagine myself, like, I always say, oh, I'm a little bit more Mike than Muhammad, because I felt like at that time in my life before Gene, just nothing was breaking through to get this film made. So I felt like I had to be scrappy, and I had to use brute force, and I had to just kind of be fearless and not worry, about anything except kind of getting to the next round. And so, to go on that, I think, I've done 4 films in the past 5 years, which is not, I think, normal for a Black woman, and to be doing, I've done 2 studio films and 2 indies, and I think in the talks that have helped me, it's just kind of some basics of like how each thing happened. So I thought I would go through some of my films and just the process. I feel like for me, Gina the Joneses, my first film, was the biggest hurdle. It's the biggest hurdle because I had nothing to show to prove that someone should give me money. And I think I was like the application queen. I went to Tribeca and Canadian Film Center and Nantucket Screenwriters Colony and just trying to get people to read it. And I still couldn't push it over the finish line. And I remember being a very cold winter in Toronto and just figuring out, how am I gonna do this? And I called up my producer at the time and I said, look, let's go back into Telefilm Canada, let's ask, for some funding. And he was just like, well, Stella, we did that last year. It didn't work. Like they said, no, we can't just go back in with nothing else, no other actors attached, no more money, no more. And I was just like, well, I'd met an independent financier at the Canadian Film Center, and I said, let's ask him if he'll just, I don't want to say his name. I was like, let's ask him if he'll come in with us and lie and say he'll give us $200,000. And they were like, he was like, but he's not going to. I'm like, yeah, just ask him if he'll come say it. And so he was a good friend. He came and just said, like, look, I never give money, I never give MG ahead of a film being released, but I believe in this project. And so he agreed. He said, I will give 200, which then pushed Telefilm Canada to say, okay, I'll give you 250. And then at the same time, I had gotta be scrappy. And then at the same time, I had a executive producer who was in LA, and she was going in for some meetings with people you wouldn't think would help, with at OWN, at BET, at TV1. And she ended up giving it to an executive at TV1 who just loved the script. And my producer called me and said, TV1 has said they will give you $500,000, their movie of the week budget. And I was like, okay. And I was like, well, I'll only take that money if they allow me to do a 1-year festival run. And he thought it was insane. He's like, this is your money. You can finally make your film. And for me, I was like, no, I want to be Spike. If this comes out on TV, no, and I won't have that moment. Like, I won't be seen as a real filmmaker. So I want their money, but they have to agree to a 1-year festival run. And then they did. So, I think we had the thing about film is like it's never going till it's already going. So I think we had about a 2-week prep, and we shot Gina the Joneses, and we were really late finishing it. And I remember that all the deadlines for South by had passed, and my producers thought we'd go to Tribeca. But I don't know, I used to be a publicist, so in my mind I thought South by is really the film festival for me. And I didn't know anyone. I ended up emailing info@southbysouthwest.com. And I was like, will you guys accept a very rough late cut? And a programmer got back to me, I think Jared Neese, and he said, if you could get it in a week. And so we'd only been editing for a week. So me and my editor just stayed day and night, for another week and put together a rough cut and sent it in. And 2 weeks later, I got into South by Southwest, and Janet Pearson called me, and it was definitely a life-changing experience for me. And from there, there's always a fight. You go to South by, you can barely get a review. I fought to get reviews. I hired a publicist. When my producers didn't really want to pay, I hired them. And then I ended up getting signed to CAA. And I think the first script they sent me 2 scripts, and one of the 2 was Everything, Everything, my second film. And, when you're talking about kind of being unorthodox, I was like, a teen romance, like that doesn't sound like me. I don't know that that's me, but at the time I felt like, look, I want to reach another stage of my career, and this is a Go studio film that I think that I could pitch and make a case for why I'm the person. So that's what I did. And I think, that's what Kiva's talking about. There's just not one path, I never pictured myself kind of doing that kind of film, but I knew if I got it and I did it, A, I would be financially secure to be able to do what I wanted, and B, it would kind of, it'd bring me onto another stage of the industry. And so I made that film. And it was definitely a learning process for it to be your first studio film. You're kind of into the fire and have much less control than you do over indie, especially when you're young and kind of new to the whole thing. And it was a hard process. And I told an interviewer today, she was like, "What regret do you have?" And I was like, "Everything, everything." And only because I felt like, I wasn't kind of strong enough in that process to make it what I think it could have been, nuances that I felt like were left out of the movie from the book. But so where there was like such positivity from it, I also felt like, oh no, I'm a hack and no one will ever take me seriously again. And it pushed me to want to do The Weekend, which is my third film. And for me with The Weekend, that really was something for me to remind myself of what my voice was, of the kind of films that when I was the girl in film school that I wanted to make. I went from making a $10 million film to a $500,000 film, without a second thought, because I felt like this is the direction I have to go, that I have to prove. And Stephanie Elaine, my producer, came on, and we ended up finding some very scrappy financing. I cast it out of my phone. I acted like I was that first-time filmmaker again, like it was my first time. And I called DeWanda Wise. I DM'd her on Instagram. I got a friend to introduce me to Alon. And, I got my old DP back from Gina the Joneses, Chris Belchevsky, and we kind of all just banded together and made a film in 13 days. Just so I could get back to myself, really, and we could all work together and build a foundation of a creative team. And, the day, like, Cameron Bailey called me to go show it at TIFF was, like, I cried like it was my first film. I think I cried more on The Weekend than I did on Gina the Joneses, because I just felt like no one's in control of my career. I'm in control of my career. I will work as much as I push myself to work, as much as I convince people to let me do what I want to do. And you can always course correct. It's never too late to kind of go the direction you want to go. When I watched The Weekend, it gave me that confidence back, that I was back on the course I wanted to go. And it was a really lovely moment with Sashir and me and the whole team. But because I'm a filmmaker, I'm never happy, or, I live in a state of depression. So from there, you're like, oh, okay, The Weekend, I did what I wanted to do. Perfect, but no one saw it. So it is on Amazon Prime and iTunes if you would like to, if you have not. But it is this thing where when you've done a studio film, you're used to this machine, you're used to a certain amount of marketing, you're used to a certain amount of distribution. And so The Weekend was so fulfilling creatively, but I still had this feeling like, how do I get my voice to a much larger audience? And that was gonna take, some strategy. And so I actually wrote the photograph before I directed any films. I'd had a meeting with Will Packer, the producer, and he had talked about a romantic drama. And we didn't agree to do it at the time because I was an unknown filmmaker, writer, unproduced, and truthfully, he wanted me to do it for free. And at the time, I decided it wasn't the right thing to do. So I focused on myself, other things. I don't know if that light means 5 minutes or now. 5, okay. So, good, we're in the home stretch. And so, I ended up going away and writing that film on my own. I bet on myself. I decided I didn't want to spend a year writing on spec, and I ended up doing some TV work and selling some TV work at the time, and then getting Gene and Everything Made in the weekend. And so by the time I came back to him after Everything, my agent put us back together, and he was like, do you want to do this? And I'm like, I want to do this. Do you want to do this? He was like, yeah, let's do this. And because of the things that I'd done, that allowed him to walk it into the studio and sell it in like 2 days, the script that I'd kind of written on my own without any help on development. And, that was a creative, there's just so many compromises in film. I don't even want to call them compromises because I think that's some of, the strategy and heroism of like taking paths that you would not, that don't seem on the surface to make sense. And, like Will is a person who is known for his big comedies and known for something much broader than I write. But I thought to myself, like, who else is gonna get me $20 million to make a movie about some Black people falling in love? There is literally nobody else who could do that. And so I decided, I asked Will, do you want to make my movie? And he said yes, and I trusted him, and we walked it into the studio. And I'm sure the studio thought it would get a little broader. The marketing looks probably broader than the actual film. And that was, to me, like a way to really get what I was looking to do, like do my voice in 3,000 cinemas, and Will and his team helped me do that, and that's something that not everyone thought, when it was announced, thought it made kind of a lot of sense for us, but you have to understand the industry, how it works, and be able to kind of work within it creatively, and I think that's how I've been able to kind of make 4 films in 5 years with certain concessions, certain strategies, certain bamboozlements of executives, and that's kind of my story. So yes, I think when I look over my career, I am definitely a little more Mike than Muhammad, a little more scrappy, a little more willing to do whatever it takes to get my films made, and I'll continue to do that. Hopefully, yes, that's the Canadian in me. The hopefully, I'm sorry. But thank you for coming to the talk. Thank you for listening to me. I hope it's been helpful.
Thank you so much, Stella. Thank you for bringing boxing in. I boxed. I didn't even have to pay her to do that, so that was truly a delight. Our next speaker is not a boxer, but he's super talented, so that's better. Joe Talbot is a 5th-generation San Franciscan who began developing The Last Black Man in San Francisco with his childhood friend and star Jimmy Fails after leaving high school early to pursue film. After debuting at Sundance in 2019, The Last Black Man in San Francisco won the U.S. Dramatic Special Jury Award and the Best Director Prize at that festival, and went on to screen with critical acclaim at many other festivals and in theaters. He is a Sundance Institute Fellow and wrote and directed the acclaimed short American Paradise. So before I bring Joe up on stage, let's watch the trailer.
We built these ships, dredged these canals in the San Francisco they never knew existed. This is our home. You two stick together.
back to the old house. What if it's empty? What if we just peeked inside?
We could throw parties. You could put on one of your plays. We could yell. Who is this house?
Our old house.
That's not your old house, and that's not your neighborhood.
Hey, if you're going to San Francisco, be sure to wear flowers in your hair.
Maybe he's right. What if we shouldn't be here? Well, we should be here more. Some millionaire.
If you leave, it's not your loss. It's San Francisco.
I don't know how much longer we can keep doing this.
But I'm not leaving. I'm the last one left.
I'm with you, brother.
Please join me in welcoming to the stage Joe Talbot.
Thank you, Kiva. Thank you so much to Miami Film Festival for having me. It's cool to see Rob Morgan in 2 trailers. He's a great actor. So today I'm going to talk about the feeling of should I stay or should I go? Specifically, the feeling of loving the cities that raised us and the urge to leave them. I talked to a group of wonderful Miami born and bred filmmakers who I think are over here Friday night. Chris and Brittany, Jay, their whole gang, and we talked about this feeling. They inspired this talk. So, for those of you that haven't seen the film, I'm sorry to spoil the ending, but at the end of our movie, Jimmy, the last black man in San Francisco, leaves San Francisco. He leaves behind the city that made him. It's the only city he's ever lived in, and he sails out into the ocean, into the great unknown. Now, this ending, when it was in theaters, seemed to provoke 2 very different reactions. Some people saw it as a suicide or a mark of giving up, and a small group of people within that were even mad at Jimmy and would ask, how could he leave behind his best friend Montgomery like that? On the flip side, and a bit more commonly, was a group who saw the end as less of an arresting ending to a life and more of a rebirth. Someone leaving the theater said to me, San Francisco doesn't deserve Jimmy. He's going somewhere more worthy of his love. For me personally, the ending always lives somewhere between these 2 poles, a fallen hero's exit, the cowboy riding off into the sunset at the end, a soldier of love, wounded and near death, but with just enough energy to carry on. Because there is, of course, great loss in leaving your community, and losing Jimmy is of equal tragedy to San Francisco, but there's also hope for something more and something better elsewhere. I often say that the ending is a mirror for how someone is feeling about their own lives and their own changing cities. Do you feel helpless? Do you feel guilty? Do you feel hopeless? Or do you feel optimistic against greater odds? For me, the seeds of that very melancholic sort of coming-of-age ending were planted as a teenager when I saw the film Ghost World. As Thora Birch rides off on a bus that we're not entirely sure is real, I remember being tugged between these 2 feelings of great sadness and hopefulness. Did she kill herself, or was she going off to art school? And somehow it felt like both to me, though Thora would actually later tell me that she felt like it was a suicide for her character. Years later, as we were writing Last Black Man, the same question felt increasingly relevant to our own lives. Do we stay in a city that we love but that doesn't always love us back, or do we go somewhere new where there's opportunity and excitement? the appeal of Elsewhere was compounded by the destruction and the displacement of our creative and our familial communities. And yet, there's that thought that many natives have. I'm sure some of you in here who are from Miami have felt this way. You have that guilt and the questioning of like, am I abandoning my post, my friends and family? And coupled with that is this anxiety that you worry if you leave, you may come back to a city that's altogether unrecognizable. And you have that thought that perhaps if you stay and you fight, you could help slow the changes or at least preserve some part of the community. So in making the film, Jimmy and I, who, as Kiva mentioned, we're both multi-generation San Franciscans and childhood best friends, we embarked on this long, fraught journey with our city. And over the course of the 5 years that it took us to make the film, our relationship with our hometown grew and shifted many times over. Sometimes we felt like it was being in love with this tortured lover. It was like this very torturous love affair. And you have moments where you're daring to break up with this lifelong partner while also being deathly afraid that they might leave you, or in the city's case, kick you out. And as a result, the first drafts of the script that we wrote were really angry. You know, for us, it was like, how could you consider leaving us for this techie, you know? They wear toe shoes, like, what is that? And this anger, of course, came out of like a deep loneliness and this feeling of being overwhelmed and inadequate to fight back against what was happening to our city. But it also came beyond just timely gentrification, out of something I think more eternal that we all go through as we're coming of age in places that don't necessarily feel like destinations. We felt the way that everybody does who I think doesn't grow up in LA or New York. You have that chip on your shoulder, that ladybird syndrome, you know, that feeling that there are these glowing metropolises to the east and to the south that only the bravest San Franciscans would dare go try their hand at. Now, this may sound strange to people that think of San Francisco as this like center of culture and thought, and in its best moments it still is. But by the time that we were growing up, San Francisco was not the place that you came to become Janis Joplin or Francis Ford Coppola or George Lucas or any of the Beats. It wasn't the city that my own dad had arrived at in his 30s to start a magazine with a group of broke but talented writers. It was now the most expensive city in the country that was driving out all of the artists and many of the people who had called San Francisco home for a long, long time. And I always said the only people that were still sort of flocking to San Francisco, not for capital, but for culture, were skaters. All the tech money in the world couldn't erode the 48 hills that we have in San Francisco that were still just as bombable as they were 30 years before that. And so skaters still to this day continue to arrive in droves to the city that founded Thrasher. But outside of that, San Francisco felt really depressing. After dropping out of high school, or as Kiva said more gently, I think leaving high school early, which that's a very nice way to put it. I lost countless friends and girlfriends to New York and LA, and I remained all the while in San Francisco. I felt like a puppy in the front window, you know, just waiting for the summers and the Christmas breaks where my friends would finally come home, and they'd come back with these stories from bigger, better cities, and I'd watch them slowly change and grow and become adults while I felt very static. They were challenged at great universities, and I hadn't been in a classroom since I was 16. They were learning the subway lines and making out with fucking James Franco, and I guess I dodged a bullet there, actually, not making out with James Franco, but at 20, I felt already sort of old and spiteful, and that Gore Vidal quote of, you know, every time a friend of mine succeeds, I die a little, that felt very accurate. You know, and with that jealousy and pessimism, I did see some of the cracks in that appealing image. You know, there was nothing funnier, I'm sure you've all felt this way too, for me, when a San Franciscan would come back home after living in New York for a year, and they were like at the height of condescension, and I was at the height of my like adoration, and I'd ask them, hopefully, you know, if they'd ever come back to San Francisco, hoping they'd say yes, and they'd, you know, invariably say something like, you know, dude, like, honestly, nah, like, the city's weak as fuck, and like, I don't know, it's just kind of provincial, and New York really kicks your ass. In San Francisco, you can kind of just coast. I mean, not you can coast, but just, you know, people can coast. I'd be like, oh yeah, of course. But inside, I'd be like, fuck you, dude. Like, and then that would be followed up often with like, so you like still living at home or whatever? And I would, you know, come up with jokes to mask my embarrassment. I'd be like, yeah, you know, I'm just letting my parents live with me for a while till they figure their shit out. But each year, I felt more and more stuck, and I became more and more isolated, and I was like retreating literally into my childhood bedroom where I would watch movies with an increasingly small group of friends, and that was the one thing that gave me joy as my heart was really darkening. And so it was in the midst of this depression that Jimmy and I began talking about making a movie, because he also felt lost and angry and without an outlet. And at first our attempts were very informal. We had no fucking idea what we were doing. We were living in my parents' house. And so my parents, I think in this like desperate act, pushed me to take some classes at City College, hoping I'd be re-inspired. I signed up for a film class, and I met a guy named Prentice Sanders who was this wonderfully unique San Franciscan, and he became the inspiration for Jimmy's on-screen best friend, Montgomery. I also met another friend as well, well, I'll call Co, who he really loved film, and moreover, he just really blew my mind. He had this amazing life. He'd grown up in Paris and Brooklyn and Haiti, and he was raised by really cool filmmaker parents. He was living with his equally supremely talented girlfriend, who was also a filmmaker. And overall, he just impressed me as like one of the sweetest, kindest, most like beautiful guys I'd ever met inside and out. And he was the exact kind of person that I was really afraid didn't come to San Francisco anymore. And he and I would talk with Jimmy and our other small group of our filmmaking dreams, and, you know, being completely outside of any sort of filmic infrastructure, all these very minuscule interactions carry this heightened importance. Like, we'd be at a bar and we'd see, oh, you know, shit, that's Rachel Rosen. She's like a programmer at SF International. Or we'd be like, dude, John Turturro's coming here tomorrow to screen his film. Maybe we can go talk to him and like see if he can help us. And of course that didn't happen. We were too afraid to go up to him. But, you know, you put these people on a pedestal in your mind, and what I imagine are very forgettable interactions if they even do happen for them, but they mean so much to you because it's almost sort of fun to do that when you're starting out, and you have friends that you bond with over that, and you hope that you can make an impression on one of these gatekeepers and that they'll maybe reach back and lend a hand. And so in this sort of midst of this, we decided to make a concept trailer for our film. It was a 5-minute piece of Jimmy skating through the city, not quite as fancy as the one you guys just saw. It was really funky. But Jimmy skates and he tells the story of his grandfather and this house that inspired the film. But just as we began shooting that short piece, New York came calling from my friend Co, who I'd met, and he got into film school there. And I begged him not to go. I was like pulling every stop. I was like, dude, that one filmmaker we met like 4 months ago, maybe he can connect us with someone. I heard he might know someone who's rich and give us some money. And then I was like, honestly, dude, fuck film school. Don't spend hella money there. This will be our film school. But on some level, San Francisco couldn't compete with New York. You know, it never could, but especially now, as all the very things and people that Co and I and all our friends had loved about the city were being pushed out, it was an unwinnable argument. And he left and I was devastated. And so it was back to me and Jimmy and our oddball friend Prentice, and our kind of motley crew, my brother. And so between shifts and on the weekends and with borrowed equipment, we finally finished the concept trailer. I edited it and scored it. We put it online. And I honestly thought, maybe this could help me get into film school, if nothing else. And then it happened. Not film school, but still never gotten into film school. A blogger posted the concept trailer. They'd found it on our Vimeo. And then another person posted it, and then I saw it popping up on Facebook, and then our local paper wrote about it, and then Vice, and all of a sudden we were getting daily emails about our film. And that's how I met the friends that would sort of become our film family, who helped us make The Last Black Man in San Francisco. I met my producer, Kalia Neal, this way. She just had written me a cold email after seeing the trailer. My co-writer, Rob, my creative producers, Luis and Natalie and Sydney. This whole sort of brain trust began to form around the movie. And it was all the people that Ko and I had dreamed about meeting. And not only that, but they'd seen our rough little trailer and they believed in us. And all of a sudden, I believed more in us, and things felt a lot less lonely in San Francisco. So it took us from that point, thank you, 4 more years to get our movie financed. We did Kickstarter, we did film tests, we experimented with hand coloring and wrote grants and labs and all the things that you do. And it was all incredibly thrilling, even though there was really nothing promised. We weren't sure if it would ever amount to getting the film made. But still, that feeling of inadequacy that I'd had all those years, both in myself and in my city, started to fade. And I watched friends who had left really struggle mightily in their adopted cities, these highly competitive, sometimes cruel places. And meanwhile, we were being nurtured and propelled forward by a very loving San Francisco. Neighbors would yell out to Jimmy, who'd seen the concept trailer, "Hey, Last Black Man." And Jimmy would be like, "That's kind of weird, but I appreciate that, thank you." Some people would come up to us crying and talk about how they lost their homes. And this was all years before we ever shot a frame of the feature, but we were in a dialogue with the very people that gentrification was happening to in our community, and they were a constant wind in our sails. And so when we finally got into production, we had to go the opposite way. We went deep into the creative cocoon. We turned off the outside world, as loving, as inspiring as it had been, and we went inward to actually make the film, to shoot it and to edit it. And in these quiet moments, we processed and reprocessed our feelings about San Francisco. We went so privately that people actually in the city started to wonder if the film was ever happening. And they'd be like, "Last Man Standing? What happened to those guys?" And yet it was coming. We knew that we were about to drop 5 years of work and a lifetime of experiences into a 2-hour movie on the city that we loved. But on the eve of releasing the film, through all the sort of tumultuousness in our relationship with San Francisco, me and Jimmy felt that after a lifetime of living and loving the city, perhaps it was finally time for us to go, and specifically either to New York or to LA. We had told the story that we wanted to tell about our hometown. We'd gone through all the sort of emotions doing that, and we wanted to finally go off. The chips on our shoulders had gone away, but now we had a real sincere curiosity about what else might be out there and how we might grow in a new environment. I thought back to the early drafts of the script, the very angry pages that read more like a diatribe, and how each draft since became a little more gentle and loving. And I really think part of that was due to meeting this film family that helped us feel less lonely and less spiteful towards the world. It was partially due to that natural maturation that happens over the course of 5 years, from your late teens into your 20s. And it was also due to the result, though, of developing some emotional distance from the city. I think we felt like we were maybe moving on. When we released the film in the city, we were overwhelmed, but for the first time, it wasn't by the insurmountable changes that we were facing, but by the resilience that we saw. In coming out of our cocoon, we realized that there were still so many San Franciscans there fighting against all odds to remain. Our premiere in the Castro Theater, which is sort of the equivalent of this beautiful theater for San Franciscans, packed in 1,400 natives, and it was the place where I, as a kid, had seen like Lawrence of Arabia and Godfather and all these classic films. And I looked out from the stage at my childhood heroes, Danny Glover, who's a native San Franciscan, and Barry Bonds, and they were sitting right next to the public school teachers and the activists that had raised me, and they were all still here. And I fell back in love with San Francisco that night. And the embrace that followed really brought my parents, who had given us so much, and our friends so much happiness. My dad shared every single article about the film. He still walks around our house quoting the movie incessantly, which is not great. My mom says that it kept her going through very difficult times, and it became sort of a celebration for us. But I think that if the movie had been released to no response, as proud as my parents were of me and Jimmy, they wouldn't have felt the same euphoria, because that doesn't really come from the film. It comes from the dialogue that ensues afterwards. And so now I'm at a bit of a crossroads like Jimmy. I'm not sailing out into the Pacific, but I am moving part-time to LA. And I'm partially there because that's where many of my collaborators wound up. Even after the success of the film, they couldn't afford to stay in San Francisco. And it's in part because I'm excited about living somewhere with a working film industry and all the wonderfully talented people that come with that, like the two other speakers that are here today. But it's also because it gives me more perspective when I go back home than perhaps I ever had when I was living there in my childhood bedroom, jealous of the friends that had left. I intend to always live part-time in San Francisco, but as I get ready to live the other half of my life elsewhere, my feelings are not that different from Jimmy's at the end of the movie. I'm hopeful, I'm anxious, I'm guilty, I'm sad, and I'm curious. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, Joe. That was beautiful. Our final speaker, Lulu Wang, is a writer and director who grew up in Miami. Her debut feature, Posthumous, was released in 2014, and her second feature, The Farewell, which she both wrote and directed, came out last year, garnering a multitude of praises, including, I gotta pause here because the list is quite long, Variety naming her among its top 10 directors to watch in 2019, and Best Feature and Best Screenplay at the 2019 Gotham Independent Film Awards, Best Feature at the 2020 Independent Film Spirit Awards, Best Film Not in the English Language at the 2020 BAFTA Awards, that one really rolls off the tongue, as well as Best Motion Picture Foreign Language at the 2020 Golden Globe Awards. Lulu will serve as the executive producer and writer on the upcoming Amazon original series, The Expatriates, and I believe she's also directing a few of those episodes as well. Oh, just casually all of them. Good fact checked. So let's watch the trailer for The Farewell.
What's wrong, Dad? Please tell me.
Your Nan is dying.
She doesn't know, so you can't say anything. The family thinks it's better not to tell her.
Why is that better?
Chinese people have saying, when people get cancer, they die. We have to go to China.
Wedding is an excuse so everyone can see her.
He's my only cousin. Don't you think I should be there?
You can't hide your emotions. If you go, Nan will find out right away.
Really 呀？咋啦？咋不说话呢？今天人多齐呀，好久没这么聚了，奶奶就等着这一天呐。来，大口咬，哇！哈哈哈哈！
你觉得我们应该告诉奶奶吗？
太痛苦了吧？
如果她想说再见呢？
你告诉她就毁了她美好的心情，你说对吧？
搭到她的肩膀上。你说我都怀疑我又不在，他俩在卧室能干啥呀？
Shouldn't we tell her? Isn't it wrong to lie?
It's a good lie. Most families in China would choose not to tell her.
你们说的啥呀？
他在英国学习，所以他会说英文。
结婚了吗？
She's dying. Can you be a little more sensitive?
What do you want from me? To scream and cry like you?
因为你把生命看成是个体的，这正是西方和东方的文化差异问题。东方人是把生命看作是集体的家庭。
I want to believe that is a good thing.
因为生活呀，不光是你去做什么，更是你如何去做。傻孩子！
好多了，好多了，好多了，再来点气儿，再来点气儿。
Please join me in welcoming to the stage Lulu Wang.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the Night Heroes Foundation, to Jay, Kiva, everyone at Miami Film Festival for inviting me here. And thank you everyone here for braving all of the warnings and the fears and for being here in this room. It really means a lot. And I'm also really honored to be on this stage with Joe and Stella, who I respect so much. So thank you. Over the last year, I've talked a lot about how I fought to make a very personal film that was 80% subtitled, that was an American film with 100% Asian or Asian American cast, and how I had to convince non-Asian producers to accept and finance my point of view. I'm not going to talk too much about that today. We've been asked to talk about heroes here, so I've been thinking a lot about who I consider to be heroic and why they're heroes to me. What are the qualities that my heroes have, both in life and in the stories that I tell? In my exploration, I came up with more questions than answers, so I did the only sensible thing one does. I asked Twitter. But before I talk about the question I asked Twitter, let me back up and give you some context. Last year, I released my second feature film, The Farewell, which was based on my personal experiences and on my own family. 6 years ago, my grandmother in China was diagnosed with terminal cancer and given only months to live. My family lives in the US, and my uncle's family lives in Japan, and we all wanted to return to China to see her, except the family in China had decided it would be better not to tell Grandma about her own terminal diagnosis. I'm sorry if you've seen the film and I'm just repeating myself, but you see in China, doctors often give the diagnosis to family members rather than directly to the patient. Since a terminal diagnosis can be so traumatic, they leave it up to the family to deliver the news. And for our family, rather than telling my grandma the truth, we staged a wedding for my cousin and his girlfriend as an excuse for us all to unite around my grandmother without making her suspicious. It was essentially a goodbye disguised as a wedding. Now, I was completely against this lie, and in this story, I was, in my mind, the heroic American with the right values, truth, and freedom. I was raised to respect independence and the individual's right to choose, especially when it comes to their own body, their own life. In real life, I felt very justified in my outrage, and when I arrived in China for this facade of a wedding, I felt like I was gearing up for a battle. I felt like I needed to go up against my family to convince them of what I knew to be best and to tell my grandmother the truth. That seemed like the natural narrative of the American hero, to stand up and fight for the values you know to be right and true. It didn't exactly go down like that. Not in real life and not in the movie. Sorry to spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen it, but this is important. Because in real life, I didn't tell her the truth. But when I set out to make the film, producers I talked to felt like I needed to go against what happened in real life. They felt like they needed a climax. They needed a protagonist that changes, a hero, if you will. They felt what actually happened in real life wasn't dramatic enough. Okay, that's fair enough, but my instinct was to stay true to the way things happened in real life, particularly because I had just done this story for This American Life, which is a journalistic show, so everything had to be based on facts, and that episode did quite well, and I felt like there was something in the reality that I needed to explore. But that meant I had to really interrogate why I didn't end up telling her the truth in real life. And if ultimately I couldn't change my family's mind and they couldn't change my mind, then what was the point of telling this story? How had this experience actually changed me as the supposed hero protagonist? What was the drama, the climax? And if I'm framing myself as the hero of this story, how was I actually heroic if I couldn't change anyone or save anyone? Was I actually being brave, or was I just stubborn and self-righteous? I knew that I, or my character in the movie, Billy, wasn't the traditional hero, but I hoped that I wasn't the villain either. Maybe I was the anti-hero, but what exactly is the difference? And so this is the question I decided to pose to Twitter. What is the difference between an anti-hero and a villain? Is it simply a matter of who we're choosing to center? Is it just a matter of perspective? I got a large variety of responses, and many of them conflicted each other, but I'll read a couple. So Aaron Stewart-Ahn, who's a friend of mine and who was actually on this stage last year, wrote, "This perspective is always defined by a character's choices and actions rather than an inherency in the character itself. In other words, no one is born a villain or an anti-hero or a hero. It depends on the choices that you make. You can become one or the other." Nimit said, "Villains go up against the good guys. Anti-heroes go against themselves." Scott McCauley of Filmmaker Magazine wrote, "I think a villain in a film is basically an antagonist, whereas an anti-hero can be the subject, protagonist, etc., but one who rejects and stands for the rejection of heroic qualities." And lastly, Eric Anderson said, "I think an anti-hero does the wrong things for the right reasons, but still for a greater good. And a villain does wrong things for the wrong reasons, usually selfishly motivated." So to summarize, some people argue that it is about perspective, about who you just choose to center. If we centered the villain in the story, they would become the hero or anti-hero. Others argue that it's actually about relatability. If you relate to them, then they are an anti-hero. But if you don't, and they are evil for evil's sake, then they are a villain. Some made the point that the villain creates an obstacle to the hero's journey. The anti-hero may be flawed, but they don't actually have to be anyone's obstacle, except maybe their own. In my story, my family wanted to hide the truth from my grandmother, and I wanted to tell her the truth. They forbade me to tell her the truth. They were the obstacle to my goal, but they were not the villains. The truth, they believed, could kill her faster than the disease itself. Knowing her, she'd get depressed. She'd likely stop eating, stop seeing friends, stop sleeping. If she lost all hope and stopped taking care of herself, she could go very quickly. But if all it takes to be a villain is to be the obstacle to the hero, then I was also the villain in my family story. My desire to tell her the truth, my ignorance of the culture of not telling, would thwart their heroic efforts to protect her. What if my telling her the truth did cause her to be depressed and quickly succumb to the inevitable? The thing about understanding the other side is that I came up with no easy answers. Understanding my family's desire to carry her burden for her as a collective did not negate my own values around individualism, truth, and freedom. Meaning I no longer believed they were wrong, but I also didn't believe I was wrong. I had to learn to hold multiple truths at the same time. As an immigrant and as a child of immigrants, I've always straddled different worlds. On top of that, my father is a diplomat. So I've always been exposed to multiple perspectives. I've made friends with those who agree with me and those who disagree with me, and even have some friends who hate other friends of mine while I love them all. It's quite common for me to find myself in the middle of a screaming, crying argument between friends, family, and other loved ones while I try to play mediator. This is not to say that I'm not opinionated or that I never take sides. I do. I guess my point can be summed up by this popular saying, that you remain the hero of your own story even when you've become the villain in someone else's. In telling a story about my family, I felt a personal responsibility to do right by them and not paint them in an unsympathetic light. I had to ask a lot of very uncomfortable questions, and the conversations we had were challenging. I can't help but wonder if I would have done that and given these characters the same justice if they weren't my family. People I see during holidays and reunions, people I know aren't bad people, and people I know will eventually watch the film and give me their opinions, whether I ask for them or not. These are people I love. These are the people who have known me since the day I was born. They changed my diapers, they raised me, they watched me grow up, they look like me, they are me. And yet, here we were at a crossroad on seemingly different sides of the fence. I can't help but wonder if they weren't my family, if they didn't look like me or speak the same language or live anywhere near me, if I knew I'd probably never encounter them, would I give these characters the same kind of care and attention? Or would it be easier to just see them as obstacles to my goal? The thing we get wrong about diversity and representation is that it's not about gender or sexual orientation or the color of our skin. It's actually about perspective. We need diversity because we need an array of perspectives. Perspective is why we travel. With more understanding comes more empathy and less fear. The other falsehood is that the push for diversity is primarily for the people of those who are underrepresented, because it means women, people of color, can finally get the jobs they deserve. But no, it's actually about hiring people who have the perspective to center a different kind of protagonist or hero than that's been presented historically. It's not about how we look on the outside, it's about perspective. But the truth is, how we look changes our lens of the world. How we look and where we live looking that way creates different perspectives for a multitude of reasons. We need perspective so we can better understand our neighbors rather than fear them. It's so men can better understand their wives and daughters and coworkers, understand the lens through which they see the world and what being a hero means to them. It's so we can have new definitions for what it means to be strong, what it means to be brave. When my father first read the screenplay for The Farewell, he was very confused. I asked him if the story felt authentic, if I was properly portraying all the members of the family and all the points of views within the family without leaning towards my own biases. He said, yes, it's definitely authentic, a bit too authentic. He worried why anybody would care. I mean, he said, this is just our everyday. Why would anybody want to see this movie? Why is anyone giving you money to make this movie? Granted, his favorite films are, action films, so his idea of a hero is very different. But yes, everyday life, where no one is actually a hero, no one is a villain. And without that simple binary, what is left? Is there drama? Will anyone care enough to watch? They did. And now, I'm not talking about moral relativism here. I'm not saying there is no right, no wrong, but most of the time, things are a lot more complicated and nuanced than we'd like to believe or have the patience for. And compassion and empathy, it feels like a moral platitude when it doesn't require any sacrifice or hard work. When it's for someone that looks like you or shares the same values as you, when it's for someone who's never made any mistakes. What if we actually measured our heroes by their capacity for forgiveness, for grace, for vulnerability, for resilience. And for all the future filmmakers out there, you're going to be telling stories that reflect a global society. And I think that, after I made The Farewell, the thing that I heard the most from audience members of all ages and genders and ethnicities was that the film felt both specific and universal. The specific and the universal are one and the same. And so many filmmakers have said, how did you do that? What is the secret? I really believe that the key to being simultaneously specific and universal is creating drama between characters without the easy and broad brushstroke of painting some as heroes and some as villains. Instead, both in stories and in real life, we must attempt to examine the existence of multiple truths and explore every character, big and small, good or bad, through their own lens. Perhaps we'll get closer to bridging the divide created by the us versus them mentality when we recognize that everyone is the hero of their own stories. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lulu. I'm actually going to ask everybody to come back up on stage, and we'll move to the second part. I think everyone has mics and water. Thank you all for sharing. It's hard to share, so thank you for being open and vulnerable with everybody. I was trying to connect everybody's talks when I was listening backstage, and something that really struck me is that when we think about heroes, we think about them, they tend to be kind of larger than life, or also someone who comes to rescue you. But interestingly, in all of your talks, you were kind of your own heroes, or you found your heroes in really close proximity to you and like the communities that you were in and people you worked with. So I wanted to begin by talking about two things that I think are connected, which is kind of getting over that imposter syndrome and learning how to fight for yourself, and how community plays into that, because I often find you can't really do it alone. So how do you go about cultivating who you work with in order to support you as well? And Stella, you're right here. So unfortunately, no. You know what? It's International Women's Day, so let's get our token guy to go first. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, no. I think that I feel less like a hero and more like maybe an anti-hero by one of the definitions you gave. I do all the wrong things maybe to try to get the right way, but. For us, I think, as I was saying just a bit, we felt really lonely. And I think there's a tendency when you feel alone or you feel scared, in your worst moments, you can become jaded and start to be a very judgmental sort of person. Jimmy and I both sort of struggled with that. And I think we saw that tendency in each other, and we don't particularly like when we're in that space. And so community really, I think when we found our people in the Bay Area that also loved movies and that also cared about the story and were really touched by what had happened to Jimmy in his real life and his want to turn this into a film, I think that just felt happier all of a sudden, and we felt more confident, and you felt more hopeful and almost sort of embarrassed that you'd ever been so cynical. It's easy now to talk about it, but at the time, I think I wasn't even aware of it. It just sort of seeps into every part of you. So it's nice to be on the other side of it now.
Do you mind maybe talk about, you know what? I don't know if you needed a prompt. You looked like you were searching for a prompt.
No, give me a prompt. That would help.
No, yeah, I think also I was thinking about, like Joe, you had said you were really advocating for Jimmy to be in your film because people didn't want that necessarily. And did you want Aquafina right away and knew like it has to be her, and you know, Stella, you were talking about like bringing people up and working with the same people and saying like, no, I want to hire this person, I want to work with this person. Maybe you can elaborate a bit on that, just in terms of like even just the hiring and creative process, how that actually is a way of building a film family as well.
Yeah, it was not a struggle to cast. Once I knew that she was the one, my producers were thrilled because, you know, obviously being at that time before she had done all these big blockbusters, she was already an influencer. And so for me, it was more about, you know, my producers seeing if I actually responded to her as an actor. But I think the challenge for me in putting together the team was that nobody wanted to make the film. Like nobody, it felt, initially when I started pitching it, it just didn't make sense in the marketplace being, you know, a Chinese language film, but in America, and with American financing. And so, you know, I think it was really, for me, about gaining the confidence to not compromise, to not put myself into an existing box, and to actually say, you know, you don't know that you need this film, but you do. But you can say that all you want. The problem is if no one agrees with you, you're still not going to get partners or financing. And so because I did This American Life, and that story did so well, it allowed me to create this piece of IP, intellectual property, and it gave producers the confidence because they heard this story and they responded emotionally. And so I think similar to, you know, maybe people seeing your trailer, you know, having this concept piece, I had all of these producers and I had choices. And that's something I never had in the past. And when you don't have choices, you're desperate. And so then you're gonna partner with whoever is willing to partner. But the ability to have choices is really such a privilege, and that's something that I guess, you know, having a concept piece can provide for you, which is a bidding war, or, you know, multiple parties, you know, pitching you as opposed to you like begging people like, please partner with me. And then you can sort of set the parameters of, you can be my partner if you meet me here, as opposed to, well, how do I change myself so I can find somebody to join my team? And that was a really long journey to get to that point.
I'm thinking too of Stella when you were saying, you know, you kind of just like walked up to someone and was like, yeah, but just give me the money, which, you know, is an easier thing to say, but then to actually do is, you know, put into action is something else. And then, as everyone did here, like make the film that they wanted to make. And interestingly, just like when Lulu was talking about marketing, you're like, I don't think the trailer is, and it's not, like the film is very different from how it was marketed. But can you talk about, you know, negotiating those kinds of, I think you said compromises, which, yeah.
Yeah, so I hope no one from Universal's here. No, I love them. They put out my film. But there are compromises, you know. It's like I talked about, you know, making an independent film that is very much your own. You know, when I watch Jean, it's not perfect, but it's everything I wanted, you know, so I you know, I'm proud of it. And then, you know, you do something like The Photograph and it is different, you know, it's more money, there's more financing, they need to recoup more, the P&A is huge, you know, the marketing. So, you know, there are compromises you have to make. I think they were fairly good to me in terms of the development of the film and the final product. But, you know, then you get to the marketing stage, which is a whole other level that filmmakers aren't always prepared for. And that's where the compromises came, you know, the Valentine's Day release, and yeah, that made me cringe. I'm not the most, I make romances, but I'm not the most romantic person. So I don't know how that works, but yeah, you know, but you know, you're trying to reach, part of me wanted to reach a larger audience so that more people could see my work and hear my voice, and that means, you know, you have to kind of try to hit the middle ground when you're marketing it in a way, and you know, there's a compromise in, you know, in everything you do. Yeah.
Yeah, that compromise in life. I thought you were reaching for your mic. Well done. I was really struck by this idea of perspective and also pitching, which I think is complicated, as you were alluding to, Lulu, because there's basically trying to like sell someone your story, and if they don't have that perspective or aren't open to it, the battle's going to be that much more uphill. And you know, from chatting with everyone here, that was a bit of the case. I'm wondering if you can just sort of talk about that, of how you know, all the times you might have heard no, and just when you just keep hearing no, how do you just not give up? It sounds simple, but I don't know, I struggle with it, so. You can mix up the order if you want, not to cut you off.
No, yeah, I think, you know, not to keep harping on community, but like for us, it's a lot easier to keep going when you have friends whose, you know, shoulders you can cry on, and when things don't happen for you. I was never like a good loser as a kid. I feel like after like, you know, soccer games or something, I was always like the angriest if we lost. And I like to think I've gotten a little bit better since then. But I think like having people around you maybe is the difference, at least for me, between maybe just going into like a bad depression that you don't bounce back from versus, you know, and some things are not just film related. It's like, I'm sure you guys had this experience too. You work on your movies for so long that invariably certain things in your life happen too during that period that can derail you. My dad had a stroke and almost died about like 2 months before we were set to go into production. So after years of working towards this, it was like this very scary thing. And I was pretty messed up from it, and there were a lot of other things that were sort of happening. I think also just that fear going into production. And a lot of my closest collaborators would like come bring food to our house. It was the house where we'd worked on the script for a long time before we could afford an office. They would come, just bring flowers to my mom, try to drive her where she needed to go. That was not anything that they had to do by any stretch. It wasn't part of the job, but you do sort of, it sounds corny, but really, like, you become a family in a way. You become incredibly close to these people. You see them at their best and their worst, and they see you that way. So, you know, I think there were a lot of moments where I could have given up, and I might have if not for them.
I think for me, the no's that were the hardest to navigate was actually like not in pitching the film, because when I was pitching the film, like I was so used to getting no's by that point. I think it was actually once the film, I had these partners, producers, people who were financing the film, and I would get notes that I disagreed with. That was really hard to navigate because, you know, I had to at some point also differentiate like what were story notes, because these are Academy Award winning, you know, writers and producers and everything, and what were cultural notes. And so sometimes I would get these notes and I would feel unseen and unheard, and like they weren't getting something, but I can't just be like, you know, you don't get it or something, right? Like, and I also had to be respectful to them when it was a story note, because also at the end of the day, I am making a film for an audience outside of my family, and so they also have to understand. So is the problem in my way of communicating it, because I'm making assumptions about what people should know that they actually don't, or is it their ignorance, and how do I bridge that, right? And how do I use that to make the story better? So it took a lot of communication. I talked to a lot of filmmakers, friends of mine, like women of color directors, and said, have you ever gotten this note? And, you know, how have you dealt with that in the past? And this is what I'm trying to get at. Do you understand this? Like my friend who is Taiwanese American, like one of the notes, I'll be more specific, was like they eat a lot. Everybody in the movie eats a lot. Like, can they do anything else but eat? And I was like, but what would they do? And they said, well, maybe they go for a walk. And I go, why would 12 people go for a walk when grandma's dying? Like, that doesn't make any sense. They were like, can they go to a market? You know, China, it must be colorful. And, you know, there's this idea of like what a cultural movie should look like. And I was like, but they have a maid who goes to the market. Like, you know, everybody has help in China, and that's also very different. It's not a classist thing. In America, you only have that if you have help, like if you have money, but like most people in China, you know, can afford that kind of, like, afford help. So like all these kinds of things, and that was like such a big battle, and they said, but we're just worried that people are gonna get bored if every scene is a bunch of people sitting around a table talking around food. And I was like, I hear that, you know, I don't think that's a bad no, because you do want, you know, production value is important in a film. And so I really had to, that no helped me to say, okay, but how do I differentiate these 3 eating scenes visually so that they're different, so that they mean different things, and so that each time we come back to people at a table, the audience, not unlike my producers, isn't gonna roll their eyes and go, oh my God, here we go again, and be bored by it, right? And then the other suggestion I finally made was, why don't we just go to China? Like, you have to come and see it. And then we can keep talking, because maybe there's something I'm not communicating. And literally by the end of the second day, they were like, no more food. Oh, I get it. Like, they were like, of course, you know, once they were in that space, they were like, of course they're not gonna do anything else but eat, because literally you'd wake up and be like, eat, you know, like 2 hours later, eat. And they were like, again? And so then we also ended up using the food as a source of tension, because that's something that you feel, is that, you know, that when you go back to China, to this family, because the grandma giving you food is a source of love, that became a source of tension for me, because to express your love back, you eat the food. But if you're feeling grief, if you're lying to her, you don't have an appetite, right? And so, but you're gonna be like, yeah, I'm fine, because if you don't eat, grandma's gonna be like, what's wrong, right? And so we use that to play with the tension. So that was one way of how you kind of take that note and try to unpack it, the different cultures, the different like perspectives, and then still, you know, do it in a respectful way where you can take that note from those producers from a different background, and everybody learns from it and ultimately makes the film better.
Yeah. I was not bored by any of the food eating. Thanks. I'm Jamaican, we eat a lot too. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I've had the same experience as Lulu. Like, the no's, of course you have the no's of making, getting the money to make a film. And, you know, I just think people want to be persuaded. They need to be persuaded. You know, no one's gonna just like hand over money to you. You know, I think, randomly on the plane, I watched like Jumanji, and they had, I like light fare on the planes, and they tell you your pros and your your cons of your character, and I was like, what are one of my pros? And it's probably like persuasiveness. You know, I think if you're going to be a filmmaker, you have to be able to persuade people to give you the money to greenlight the film, and then you also, after they give you the money, have to persuade them to keep the scenes that you want, to cast the characters that you want. Like, when you look at like the photograph, I think the studio probably didn't want to cast 75% of those people, you know? Who is this? Who is Rob Morgan? Who is Jasmine Cephas-Jones? Who is Kelvin Harris? Like, you just are like, and you have to start thinking about it as like, this isn't an argument, this isn't a battle, this is a constant education of why you're making this film, why the choices you're making matter and are important, and it's, you know, being able to kind of turn those no's into like, you know, a level of understanding of why you have to do it. If you're not able to kind of persuade people and explain your point of view, you know, you'll end up with something you're very much not happy or proud of. And I think community definitely plays into it, you know, like. When I was finishing up my film, I had like, you know, Rada Blank come, you know, who's a good friend of mine, who premiered her film at 40-Year-Old Version, that I went and gave her notes before she went to Sundance, and, I talked about my, getting my editor onto my film. That was me calling my friend Stephen Capel Jr. to just be like, on Creed, he had a brand new editor. I'm like, how did you get her on? Like, what did you say to convince the studio? And he's like, I didn't say anything. I just refused to meet anyone else, kind of. I just refused to take no for an answer. And just him saying that little thing made me feel like, okay, I'm just not going to take no for an answer. Every time someone calls me and says no, I'm just going to be like, this is the editor, this is the editor, this is the editor. And I also said, sure, send me a studio editor that's a Black woman and I'll consider it. And since there's one, and she was busy with Gina Prince Bythewood or Ava or Casey, because that's who she works for, I was like, they really couldn't say no. So, you kind of have to be a strategist with that stuff and ask your friends how they did it.
I think, when I was, I guess watching the trailers was like all the films were coming back to me and I was again trying to draw these connective threads and I was struck with, they're all really specific portraits of also places that really upend expectations of, very familiar, in 2 cases familiar, maybe less, in your film, Lulu, but familiar to you in a way that disrupts a very Western, maybe Orientalist conception of things. I'm wondering if you can just talk about that, about filming places that you love and are so close to you, because I also just love city symphony films, and I think that's an undertone in all of your work too.
I'll keep it the same order.
You can mix it up too.
We grew up watching a lot of movies that blew up the Golden Gate Bridge. We got kind of tired of it. I just did a talk at Lucasfilm, and I was like, oh, those damn movies blowing up. Oh, that was you guys that did that. Sorry about that. Anyways, because they do all the special effects. But I think for us, it was like, you have that thing, I'm sure, like for you guys, Moonlight was that way, being from this city. It's like or Lulu being here, you know the people that either came up in your city or that made movies about your city. You sort of like obsessively watched those movies. And yet there were some great San Francisco films. There's a real history of great film in San Francisco going back to, the 40s with all those. Hello? Hey, I think we're good. Yeah. But we never saw the side of the city that we spent most of our time in. And so we just tried to set as many scenes in those places as possible, both in those sort of beautiful Victorians that pepper the streets of the Mission, where Jimmy and I grew up with, but also places like candy houses. And what we didn't realize until after the film was done and at Sundance and then about to be in theaters was it became like this accidental archiving of the city. A third of the locations that are in our film, which was in theaters as recently as this summer, don't exist anymore. The house that Montgomery lived in, the 2 lots next to him that were empty have now been built on. The Candy House was in these housing projects called Double Rock that are really famous in San Francisco. They've been torn down. The SRO that Rob Morgan's character lives in, that doesn't exist anymore. And it's just a city that's changing so quickly. So part of it became, okay, how do we capture this San Francisco before it's gone? Because for people that remember that, hopefully it can kind of shoot you back to that feeling you had in that city when it existed.
I didn't grow up watching a lot of films about China, because there weren't a lot from America. And then, I might have seen like Wong Kar-wai or things like that. But China's a really big place, and places are very, very different. And so it was important that we created an aesthetic around this neighborhood, around this setting, right? That was specific and authentic, but it was still an aesthetic. What I mean, for example, is that you know, you might see Wong Kar-wai and there's a lot of like, it's a lot of period pieces, so it's a lot of like fluorescence on the street and it's all like really, really beautiful. But there's a lot in China that from a Western point of view might be seen as ugly, right? Like fluorescent lighting inside of the homes. And for us, going back, it's part of the discomfort of being in a very, very brightly lit room with overhead lighting. And so, especially lying to my grandmother and all of that, like it contributes to this sense of tension. But at the same time, it's also warm. And so my DP and I really wanted to figure out how to capture that authentically, the fluorescent lighting, because it is such a characteristic of that place, but doing it in a way that was loving and that still held the tension, but that made, I mean, this is very technical, but when you light with fluorescent, what it does is it makes everybody look green and it makes them look dead. And so we were trying to figure out how do you feel the fluorescent in the room, but still make skin tones feel warm. And so that was just one example of making the setting a character in the movie. You know, also these orange buildings, they're peach-colored buildings. That was very characteristic of my grandmother's neighborhood and Changchun, her city in general. We kept seeing them. So we really wanted to embrace that. And so, you know, you're kind of inviting the audience by seeing those orange buildings. We have this pull-out shot early in the movie. But then it's sort of like you're building this language and this feeling of home for the audience, where every time they now saw those peach buildings, they think of Nai, they think of grandma. And there's a sense of familiarity, the same way that you introduce a character, and then every time you see them, you're like, oh, that is so that person. So yeah, I think that was really, and I think a lot of like Americans said, oh, we've never seen China that way, and then a lot of Chinese people were like, why did you show that? That's not romantic enough. It's not like modern or beautiful enough, because there is a tendency, I think, when you're actually from there to not want to show the things that are more real and to want to make it feel glossier, especially when it's an international film that's going to be seen by outsiders.
Yeah, I guess in the photograph it was kind of a juxtaposition of places, you know, between New York and Louisiana. And, you know, New York I'd lived in for, 6 or 7 years. And so I felt like I was familiar, although I didn't have as much money as May when I lived there. So it was a bit more of a glamorous New York, like a very kind of warm New York. And I wanted that New York to be, I wanted it to feel like kind of this very sexy and warm and, New York that you wanted to kind of just like slip into and stay and wish your life looked like it. I love New York, but it can be so hectic. And I think in my film, minus kind of the storm, it's a little calmer. It's kind of, I think, more of an aspirational version of the city, to be honest, than kind of the city that I experienced when I lived there when I was younger. Louisiana was interesting for me to shoot because, I hadn't spent a lot of time there at all. And I wanted to capture, something that I didn't have. On my other films, it's like, I really knew what I wanted, the look and the feel of it. And Louisiana was like a feeling out process. So when I was really went down to scout and was on these oyster boats talking to fishermen, starting to feel that's when because I felt fearful, will I be able to shoot this and it feel real? And and standing on that boat and having these this oysterman and his son explain their journey to Louisiana and how the process of fishing, so that I could get to know kind of my character of Isaac. You start to feel this tangible thing, and wanting to put that into Louisiana. And there was kind of two looks to Louisiana as well, with the present day, which we kind of shot a lot of handheld, and then the stuff set in the 80s that we used a lot of anamorphic lenses just to make it kind of softer and a little stretched. And place is very important to me. I mean, I'm first generation Canadian, my family's Jamaican, so for me city means so much. Yeah, I really related to Joe talking about, when he was talking, the idea of when I had to decide to leave Toronto. Yeah.
I do want to open it up to the audience if there are any questions. Please raise your hand nice and high. I will also repeat the question for the benefit of folks who might not have heard. So the question's for everybody, and it's advice to an emerging filmmaker who might not have access to film school or just is trying to build that community for themselves, if you're in the process of doing it.
I didn't go to film school, and I moved out to LA. I didn't know a single person, and I had the same question probably for like 7 years. And it wasn't until after I made The Farewell that I was like, whoa, how did this happen? But it's a challenge, because I think that's the biggest thing that people who've gone to film school tell me that they get are those collaborators, but not everyone can afford it. And also, if there are other ways to make collaborators. And I think the advice that I heard that was the most helpful was to not network vertically, but to network horizontally. Really go to writers groups, go to work, try to meet people who are at the same level as you, who are trying to do what you're doing. Try to find DPs that are, working on shorts, and if you're a director. Because I think that is a mistake, especially in LA. People are so ambitious that they're like, if only I got my script to that person, and I'm that person now. Sometimes people come up to me, like, I don't know how to help you. I really can't. The best thing that you can do is find your people and go make your thing together. I think that's my advice.
I really agree with that. When we started, I remember being like, okay, this movie will be perfect if Danny Elfman scores it. And I had all these lofty ideas about, I just need the best people in the world to help me, and then it'll be great, right? But I think that, it sounds like Lulu and I had a similar experience where it was like, we put these pieces out into the world, and yours found so many people, and ours found an audience, and it was something we did really simply. We shot it with a few friends, and none of us knew really what we were doing. You could argue you could do it with even less, maybe just 1 or 2 people. I know there's a group of filmmakers here tonight who are all networking and have made really cool work together already, and they're showing here. So sometimes it's as simple as just walk a few, an aisle over and talk to people, and it can be a little intimidating at first, but I do think exactly what Lulu said is true. It's find the people, if you can, that are your age at festivals like this or workshops, and eventually you just get a sense of we like enough of the same things, and they push me as well in enough of the right ways. You don't always have to agree, but if there's a good tension there that you feel, I always think that's a good marker.
I'll just piggyback off them quickly. It's just that, and I think someone gave me really good advice my first trip to LA for meetings, that you have to be able to offer something to someone. If you're sitting down with someone, and there has to be a reciprocity, and that goes with working, laterally. People who are really going to be able to help you are the people who need something from you, and you need something from them. Steven Spielberg probably doesn't need anything from you. That's just the truth. But he will if you make your phone, and so you really do have to kind of work with people who need you, and you need them, and that will keep, everybody working.
The question is in regards to music and how that influenced you, but I also think that nicely works with everyone else's films, so if anyone wants to speak to it after Lulu.
Go New World. I was actually in the music department at New World, classically trained pianist. So I think on a unconscious level, music is a big part of just who I am. I hear, when you grow up playing piano since the age of 4 and playing every single day, it's inevitable that it's a part of the rhythm, the way it flows. So when I'm writing even dialogue, I think about the rhythm of of the way people talk. I think about the rhythm of editing, you know, like I think about the editing as I'm writing scenes, even like, you know, maybe a long beat of silence feels like a rest, and then a really hard cut out of that silence into something really loud, like somebody crying, you know, is very jarring. And so I think about all of that. But in The Farewell, I knew I wanted to do a classical score, and because Billy doesn't play piano anymore, I knew I didn't want it to have piano. But I also knew I wanted it to be all vocals, because I wanted to invoke the Greek choir, you know, which represents a community, society, the pressure of being chased by a group, a collective group of voices. So I went out specifically and hired a composer that was classically trained, who's Alex Weston, and works with Philip Glass. And so he works very quickly because we're an indie film as well. He has done countless arrangements for Philip Glass and can work very quickly. I said, okay, we don't have very much time. Why don't you just take existing classical pieces and adapt it for vocals? But instead he wanted to do original. So he very quickly actually came up with themes and wrote everything, and then we hired a small group of vocalists to sing. And then we also had a soloist who represents the individual voice, who is a male, like I think he's an alto, but he's singing high soprano, so he's singing in falsetto. And so it was giving this idea of the individual there was something a little bit off about the soprano voice, right? Inspired by Bobby McFerrin. And so I had all of these conceptual ideas of how the music was actually thematically tied to this theme of individualism versus collectivism, and then the rest was Alex Weston.
Yeah, I mean, I love music. Probably have too much of it in the film. I mean, for me, for the photograph, it was like just a huge experience to work with Robert Glasper, jazz pianist, and that was really a dream come true to kind of be in the studio with him, you know. And the score was like created in a more unorthodox way and more jazz way, you know. Normally, you know, you have all the pieces and then you go into, you know, on one day to record everything, and with him, you know, we would send him reels as we were editing, and then we would just go in and we'd kind of record on a daily basis for a few months, until we had everything, and he freestyled everything, you know, everything. You know, there's just there's a moment when she's reading the final letter where, you know, I would just try to, you know, talk to him like of what I felt like. I felt like this was a free jazz moment that didn't really have too many motifs. That was just like, you know, just got to her kind of emotions unfurling, and he was able to create, you know, things on the spot. And so it was a huge part of the process and a huge part of the film to get across the emotion.
San Francisco has a very proud music history. You know, I mentioned some of the great musicians that sort of we associate with, like the '60s San Francisco sound. And so those have always sort of floated in my brain. My parents played a lot of music growing up. They also played a lot of film scores. And so I grew up with really big scores like Last of the Mohicans and a lot of Michael Nyman stuff in the '90s, and they were just like symphonic. And I actually think, like in the case of Last of the Mohicans, like the score is almost better than the rest of the movie. You know, I don't know worked on that film, but it really elevates it. It's amazing what music can do, and I think that's, for me, I was saying this earlier, but like, that's still one of the most fun parts of the process. I wonder if you guys feel that way too, but like, when you just drop music in even temp, and you see how much it shifts the tone, like, even, you know, two songs off the same album by the same artist recorded at the same time can feel so different. It's kind of an incredible thing. And so for our score, we wanted a big orchestra score, but we couldn't quite afford it. And so but I had gotten, to what Stella was saying earlier. I was like, we need the score. This is like, it has to be this, and I really fought for it. And I met this guy. I'd been meeting composers. I wasn't meeting anyone that I was connecting with, and then I was sent this audition in the form of a piece written to the opening sequence of our movie. And it was like he understood everything that we wanted. He had this like sense of old Hollywood, the big scores. It felt fresh and new, and it kind of blew my mind. And I was expecting to meet this person and him to be this old, bespectacled, balding, composer with like a turtleneck and wisps of white hair. And he was like this 30, like hunky guy in a band, and I was like, you didn't write this, man. There's no way, but he did. His name's Emil, and so Emil hatched a plan and went to Budapest to record the score. And I was listening over Skype and crying, listening to these amazing musicians play it. So where there's a will, there's a way. But yeah, music is. It's that amazing, magical tool.
I'm so sorry. I'm getting the signal that we have to wrap up because there's a film in here afterwards. I really feel like I heard this half of the auditorium, and I'm really, really sorry. But I think it's a testament to the filmmakers we have here, all the questions, the inspiration. Thank you so much for coming.